In this video, we're going to create new identities on our PyData archive, assign them custom permissions, and map them to our Windows groups and users or SDK applications. Keep in mind, the ability to use identities in your security model is available with PyData archive versions 3.4.380, 36, and later. To start off, we need to first identify what identities should we create? How can we map them to our Windows groups? And what permissions should we give them? And these decisions all should be customized based on our individual organization's needs. As a first step, let's say, for example, at our company we have user groups, right? And all of our employees use the Pi system. But we also have some external consultants that use some of the data from our Pi system too. Now, these users, they have different needs. For example, our employees, we want them to be able to see the data for all of our Pi points, for example, and maybe the external consultants only need to see data for Pump 5 Pi points for a particular asset that they're helping us troubleshoot. In addition to our user groups, we might have applications that write to or read data from the Pi system. For example, Pi Core Site might be an application that we're using to deliver data over the web to our users. Pi Core Site also has specific needs. Next, what we want to do is identify, are there Active Directory Windows groups for these users? And what service accounts are we using for our applications? So we can identify this, and let's say that we've got a couple of domain groups for our users, and that this is the service account that we're using for Pi Core Site. Keep in mind that in this example, for the Pi Core Site app pools and the Pi Web API crawler, we're using this same service account. We take these groups and accounts and come up with corresponding Pi identities that we can use on the PyData archive. In our case, let's create Pi identities here that correspond to these different Active Directory groups. So for example, All Company group, we'll create an All Company Pi identity. And the same, we'll do for consultants. We'll also create one for Pi Core Site. We still need to be able to link our Active Directory groups and accounts to our Pi identities. So we'll need to create mappings for them. Once we have the mappings created, we still also need to set up permissions for these new Pi identities. So in our case, based on the needs we just saw, these are the permissions that we're going to need. Keep in mind, for these permissions, you'll see that there are permissions that are specifically on the database security level, as well as the individual Pi point level. This video, we're going to be covering the database security permissions, and there's a subsequent video where we're going to be showing how to configure individual Pi point security. If you're not sure what would make sense for the permissions here, there's a really great reference in the PyLive library that can help with that. Let me show you that. We have here this task-based access permissions reference, which can be found in the Pi Server user guide. And what it has is a list of tasks and their corresponding database security permissions, just like what we were looking at. And if there are any other permissions that are needed, that's here in this final column. So this is a great reference to help you identify what permissions would correspond to the specific tasks that you want your users or applications to do. Additionally, you can check individual products user guides. For example, for Pi Core Site, in the installation and administration guide, it has the security requirements listed. Now that we understand the plan for the new identities, mappings that we will create and their corresponding permissions, let's start doing that. We're going to use Pi System Management tools to do this. So I'm going to navigate to a machine where I have Pi System Management tools installed. I'm going to open up Pi System Management tools. In order to configure security for your users and your applications, you need to be able to have write access to each database security area. And we're going to confirm that I have this to begin with. So I'm going to open the security plugin and click Database Security. These are all the different database security tables, and you'll see that the current permissions these different areas have. For me to configure security, I might need to assign permissions on any of these areas, and that means I need to have read-write access to all these areas. Because in this system, I am the Pi System Administrator, you can see and confirm that I am connecting with Pi admins, and that Pi admins does have write access to all of these. So I'm going to be able to configure the security, and this is something that you need to confirm for you as well. Let's begin by creating the new identities that we're interested in. So we'll navigate to Identities, Users, and Groups. You can see that there are some identities already listed here. So these 4 identities, Pi Engineers, Pi Operators, Pi Supervisors, and Pi World, these are actually default identities. They're pre-built as examples in the system. And because of the fact that we're focusing on custom security configuration, I'm not going to be using any of the default identities. We're going to be creating the new identities that we planned out. One thing I do want to point out, however, is that one of these identities, this one right here, Pi World is similar to the concept of everyone in Windows. Pi World has, by default, read permissions on a lot of the database security areas, and by default as well, any authenticated user to the Pi Data Archive will receive Pi World. So it's something to keep in mind, and we're going to see how this impacts us later in this video. To create new identities, you simply need to right-click, and then I can select New Identity. I'll want to give the identity a name. So let's create the All Companies identity first. So I'll just call that All Company. And I'll also want to give it a description to make it very clear. And then hit Create. I'm going to use the same process for creating identities for consultants. Hit Create, and same thing for Pi Core Site. Okay, so I have successfully created the 3 new identities, All Company, Consultants, and Pi Core Site. Next, I'm going to create mappings for them by going to the Mappings and Trusts. You'll see any mappings that currently exist. And to create a new mapping, we'll just need to right-click and select New Mapping. We're going to need to provide it with the Windows account. In my case, All Company, there's a domain group. So I'm going to search for the domain group here so I can confirm that I have the spelling correct. Okay, and I'll give it a description again to make things easy for everyone to understand. And very important down here, I'll need to select a Pi identity. I can search for Pi identities using this and select the All Company identity that we just created and hit Create. And I'll go through the same process for consultants. finding the group, providing a description, and assigning it the consultant's Pi identity. And I'm also going to need to create a mapping for my PyCoreSite service account. Keep in mind the previous two, I used domain groups, but you can also use domain accounts, a user or a service account. For example, let's add the PyCoreSite service account. And then pick the PyCoreSite identity and hit create. I'm going to just expand these to make everything easy to see. Okay, so now I have the 3 mappings created for my 2 domain groups as well as for my domain account. If you don't have Windows domain groups that align to the permissions that you're trying to set on the PyData archive, what can you do? You can use individual domain users. You can also use local groups. These local groups would be set up on the PyData archive. Keep in mind that if you're doing it on a mappings on a user basis, that's going to be a lot of work because you're going to have to create a lot of mappings. Groups definitely are better from a manageability perspective. One thing to keep in mind though with the local groups is that local groups don't work with the index search used by PyCoreSite. If a user is relying on a mapping that's based off of a local group, they will not be able to search for data in PyCoreSite to add to their displays. They will be able to view the data in already existing displays, but they won't be able to use that PyCoreSite search. So that's something to keep in mind. And given this, if you don't have existing domain groups, it can be a really good time to talk to your IT team and see if you can have domain groups that would match up with your corresponding Pi permissions. And hopefully your existing domain groups are based on job roles that will align well with Pi permissions that will be needed. Also, if you are in a work group, you'll need to create identical users with the same passwords and groups on each and every machine in your system. At this point, we have our mappings, which will link our users and applications to their corresponding Pi identities, but they won't be able to do anything yet because we haven't assigned those identities any permissions. So let's go ahead and assign them permissions for the database security. So switch over to database security. Okay. Remember that we saw before for all company and consultants, we're interested in giving them permissions that are specific to Pi points, and we want them to be able to read data for all or some Pi points. To be able to do this, they're going to have read access on the Pi point table. So to add those identities here, I can select the Pi point table, double click it, and be able to add new identities or even remove them if I was configuring things differently. So I'm going to hit add, and I'm going to add all company, add consultants, having them both selected. I'll uncheck write because I want them to have read, and hit OK. Let me expand this. Okay, so we can see that we successfully added all company and consultants for PiPoint. In addition to our users, we were also planning the security for PyCoreSite. PyCoreSite app pools are going to need read on PiPoint, so let me actually jump back to PiPoint and add PyCoreSite. As read. Okay. And because the corresponding PyWeb API crawler is going to be receiving the PyCoreSite identity, I'm also going to need to give the PyCoreSite identity read on PyUser, PyMapping, and PyDBSec. So let me go ahead and do that now. So with that, I successfully assigned the database security permissions. But it's important when you're making these assignments to also test them, right? To ensure that these are the correct permissions and that everything is working as expected. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to have some of my users test connecting to the PyData archive with PySystem management tools and make sure that they are receiving the access that we expect. So I'm going to open up PySystem management tools, but running it as a different user. So you can shift and then right click run as a different user. So we have Isaac, and Isaac is a member of the all company domain group. So his Windows user is iUser to make things easy for us. And down below here, we can see the difference. So the Windows account here is iUser. Earlier, it was my Windows account, C. Metzinger. Okay, so as a test, we know that the all company identity, we didn't set up explicit permissions for that on mappings to see the mappings we just created. So as a test, let's have Isaac try to look at the mappings. So security, mappings, and trusts. Okay, great. As expected, Isaac cannot see the mappings, and we can see that down here we receive the security error, no access, and we know that our identity is being mapped correctly to our Windows groups because we can confirm that Isaac received the all company identity that we just created. Let's do a test also with our consultant to make sure that our consultant's identity and mappings also work. So we have a consultant named Sarah. Sarah is part of our domains consultant group, and her user is sconsultant. Again, just to make things easy. Okay, again down here, we see that this is for Sarah, and Sarah will take the same steps and try to look at the mappings. So again, Sarah cannot see the mappings. She receives the security error indicating that she doesn't have access, but we do know that her mapping is working and she is correctly receiving the consultant's identity. So that looks good. One thing that we can also do is let's have Sarah test some of the other areas. So for example, the database security table. Oh no, so we can see that Sarah can see the database security table even though we didn't give consultants specific access to do this. Now, why is this happening? Well, this is because PyWorld is enabled. So down here, Sarah, in addition to receiving the consultant's identity, also received the PyWorld identity. And same for our other users, Isaac and myself. Everybody who is authenticating is receiving PyWorld. And if we look at the table area PyDBSec, we see that PyWorld has read access. So anybody who has PyWorld is going to be able to see database security. And this also points out the fact that you can have more than one identity, user, and group, and your permissions, you will just need to have one of those identities has to have permissions, so the permissions add up. Now in our case, this isn't what we want. We don't want our consultants to be able to see anything other than the data they need. We don't want them to be able to see any of our security settings. So what can we do? Well, we can change the permissions that PyWorld has, similar to the way that we added identities on the different areas. We could remove identities or change their permissions. We can also disable the PyWorld identity. And that's in fact what we're going to do. So let me show you how we can disable the PyWorld identity. I'm going to jump back to my user. Remember, I'm the Pi System Administrator. And I'm going to go to the Identities, Users, and Groups. Okay, now before you consider disabling PyWorld, it's important to understand that this is a great step as a best practice in a new system, but in an existing system, you need to first check and identify if any of your connections are using PyWorld, and you need to switch them over to using different authentication. So either creating some new identities or giving their existing identities new permissions, right? You'll need to overhaul your security to make sure that PyWorld is no longer needed. And then you can go and disable PyWorld. You need to do this in advance because you want to make sure that you're not stopping your users that have been relying on PyWorld or even your applications. Because of the fact that I am in a new system, I am okay to go ahead and disable PyWorld right now. And I'm going to go ahead and do that by double clicking and then checking this box for identity is disabled. And then hit OK. You'll notice as soon as I checked that the PyWorld identity shows gray here, and if I switch back to the database security, while I still see PyWorld listed here, if I double click, I can see that it is also gray here, indicating that it's disabled. One thing that you might notice, however, is that down at the bottom, though, it still says that I have received PyWorld. That's because I had already connected before we disabled it. So while new connections won't receive PyWorld, any existing connection, it's not going to eliminate PyWorld from it. So let's have Sarah connect again and show that once she has a new connection, she no longer receives PyWorld. So an easy way to do this is that we can uncheck the data archive, check it again, and then select the specific plugin. So right now we can see that Sarah no longer can see the database security table. She receives the security error indicating that she doesn't have access, and she only receives the consultant's identity. She no longer receives the PyWorld identity as well. So we have it disabled, and moving forward, all new connections will not receive it. Okay, so with that, we have successfully set up our identities, mappings, and permissions for our users and applications as planned. And regardless of your user or SDK application, you'll follow the same steps to configure security for them. You'll create the custom identities and mappings and assign them the permissions they need and test it to make sure that everything works appropriately. Keep in mind that in addition to the database security, which we just set up, there's also other permissions and other security. And one that impacts every user is the security on individual PyPoints. So in the next video, I'll show you how to configure PyPoint security for your users and applications.